Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and welcome to episode 35 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I'd like to take a look at transaction monitoring, where it came from, where it may be going, where it's been, where it may be going, and what the Department of Justice has communicated to us about this very interesting subject. It is a very clear example of how compliance programs evolve over time. It is something that the department began to speak about almost 2 years ago. At that time, it was pretty cutting edge in terms of a component of your compliance program. It has moved to a best practices, and I think certainly within this year, it's going to become a standard practice. So I would like to review where it came from, or at least where it was initially publicly discussed, how it may be been used in some of the enforcement actions, and then what the department has communicated to us most recently. Transaction monitoring was discussed for the first time publicly by the Department of Justice in the Morgan Stanley declination. That was also the first publicly released declination. It was released in April of 2012. The Department of Justice declined to prosecute Morgan Stanley in view of the overall state of their compliance program, even though their managing director, Garth Peterson, had engaged in conduct which violated the FCPA. There was a series of factors, I think 8, that were listed by the Department of Justice as reasons why they declined to prosecute, also the Securities and Exchange Commission. And transaction monitoring was one of those. Indeed, it was through transaction monitoring that Morgan Stanley was able to detect that Mr. Peterson had engaged in conduct which violated the FCPA. And this was really the first time we had seen transaction monitoring as a part of a compliance program. This got a lot of attention, and people started talking about it, although transaction monitoring has been talked about as an integral part of a compliance program for several years. Joe Orangel at Visual Risk IQ has written about continuous controls monitoring. Patrick Taylor at Oversight has a transaction monitoring tool. So this is something that I think is known within the industry. Nevertheless, it was the first time we heard the Department of Justice formally talk about it, even though it was in the context of a declination. Moving forward into 2013, we had a very interesting case enforcement action involving Eli Lilly. For those of you who do not recall, the Lilly enforcement action was in December of 2012. In this enforcement action, Lilly was accused of 4 separate bribery schemes across the globe, one in China, one in Russia, one in Poland, and one in Brazil. The one in China was involving its own employees and overcharging their expense accounts and expenses to create a pool of money to be used to pay bribes. In China and Russia, they were paying bribes to third parties who were either at the direction of foreign governmental officials or were actually foreign governmental official owned. These third parties tended to be offshore from Russia on the island of Cyprus, and there was no due diligence or any other management of this risk by Eli Lilly. But there were 2 bribery schemes that I think would lend themselves to a transaction monitoring approach, so I'd like to go into those in a little bit of detail. The first was in Brazil, and in Brazil, Eli Lilly's sales model was a distributor model as opposed to a commissioned sales agent or direct employees. And in the distributor model that Eli Lilly used, that they had a program, policy, procedure, and protocol for approving a distributor. They further had a established discount rate by which a distributor could purchase Lilly products and then resell them. The discount rate was between 6 to 12% per product. There was a protocol that the company was to follow when bringing on a new distributor. A specific distributor was brought on to make sales in one province in Brazil. This distributor did not go through the normal due diligence process, although the distributor was approved by the distributor committee, internal Lilly distributor committee. It did not have the normal amount of due diligence, it didn't have the normal amount of vetting, and it was done really at the insistence of the Eli Lilly Brazilian country manager. So that obviously are red flags to start with. But the interesting thing was or at least from the transaction monitoring perspective, I should say, was the discount rate. I mentioned that Lilly had a standard discount rate of 6 to 12%. However, in the case of the distributor in question, they were given a discount rate of 18%. As you know, there's no established rate or discount rate for a distributor under the FCPA, nor in any enforcement actions. But the key is that you document whatever your decision is and why you have made that. The 6 to 12% established rate was well documented within Lilly. However, this 18% was not. This difference between 12 to 18% of the discount rate was then used by the distributor to come up with a pool of money to pay bribes for governmental officials in Brazil, and this distributor became the highest grossing distributor for Lilly in Brazil. So pretty interesting set of facts there. The fourth bribery scheme was in Poland, and in Poland they used a charitable donation bribery scheme. Under the charitable donation bribery scheme, this was in the province of Silesia, and in Silesia, the Director General of the Silesian Health Service, the person who had actual decision-making authority over Lilly to obtain or retain business, award contracts, make payments, etc. This individual had a charitable foundation that he had founded. It was called the Chudau Foundation. It was a legitimate charitable foundation, and it renovated castles in Poland. And what Lilly did was at every point in time where a decision needed to be made to obtain a contract, retain a contract, or make a payment, Lilly would make a charitable donation to this specific charitable foundation, the Chudau Foundation. In the SEC complaint, and interestingly, this was not a Department of Justice enforcement action, so there was no criminal complaint filed against Lilly or no deferred prosecution action. It was a civil matter filed by the Securities and Exchange Commission. But in the SEC complaint, they actually lined up the amount of the charitable foundation, the amount of the contribution to the charitable foundation, the timing of the contribution to the charitable foundation, and the date that the Director General made a decision to obtain or retain, award business, award contracts, make a payment, etc. to Lilly. The amounts of these charitable donations were not large. The most was $7,500, and it was down to a couple of $1,000s. But over a 2-year period, it totaled up to several $100,000, or at least a couple of $100,000. This led to the province of Silesia becoming the highest grossing province for Lilly in Poland, and indeed a sales spike of, I believe, 77%. I raise these and I go into some detail in both of these because I think these are the best examples I can point to you of an enforcement action that we have public information on where transaction monitoring would have come in and what transaction monitoring could have brought to the table. Certainly in Poland, if you have a sales spike in one province of 77%, as a businessman or a business reason, you need to know why you've got that sales spike. Well, here, there was no way to tie together the charitable donation with the sales spike or any other factors. Typically, you would want to know, why did you have such a sales increase? Do you have a new sales team in place? Do you have a new product? Did you have a promotion? Did you engage in new marketing? Whatever it may have been. This is something that Lilly's management in Europe, in Europe or elsewhere should have been interested in. But now I think with transaction monitoring, you can take a look at this from the compliance perspective. You can put the compliance data points in and see if there's anything illegal, because once again, you're just looking at numbers, but certainly it gives you the ability to analyze it, measure it, put it in a format that simply ties things together. If they had had transaction monitoring in either Poland or Brazil, I think Lilly would have been able to at least have some red flags raised, or at least some questions raised, which would have allowed them to consider whether or not there was a compliance problem and investigate this going forward. So these are two excellent examples in one enforcement action where I think transaction monitoring would have been very helpful. Now let's move forward into 2013 in the Weatherford and the Diebold enforcement action. And interestingly, in both of these, they listed of course, minimum best practices and the Schedule Cs for the DPAs. And the last one, they said that the company had to monitor international trends for compliance programs and enforcement. And this was really the first time we had seen, even if you call that catch-all language, it's still language which indicates that the Department of Justice is requiring these companies to keep abreast of evolving best practices. Lanny Brewer, when he was number 2 at the Department of Justice, made clear that he thought your compliance program would have to evolve. It should evolve. It certainly should evolve in terms of your risks, the products you have, the services you're delivering, where are you doing business, the types of business you're doing with your customers. If any of those change, your risk profile is going to change, and you measure that through a risk assessment. But what about technology? What about the new technologies that have become available? I mentioned oversight. I mentioned Visual Risk IQ. Both of those companies have transaction monitoring software available that they can come in and take a look at the types of transactions you've engaged in from the compliance perspective and see if there are any red flags that pop up that need further investigation. So now we have come from the point where the Department of Justice first talked about transaction monitoring, which of course was in the Morgan Stanley Declination, through the Eli Lilly enforcement action at the end of 2012. And near the end of 2013, we have an obligation on companies to engage in or monitor evolving best practices in the compliance field. I think this is something that bears watching. I think that the department expects you to take a look at not only your risks, but where has compliance gone. Obviously, in 2007 and 2008, having a written policy, compliance policy with written procedures, was where most companies were if they had anything in place. I think we are far past that, and the question now is, are you doing compliance, not do you have a compliance policy and procedure in place? So best practices evolve. There's also something else I think that the compliance practitioner and indeed senior management needs to be cognizant of. If you get involved in one of these enforcement actions, it's going to be several years probably after the incident in question. An FCPA enforcement action can last 2 to 4 years. We saw enforcement actions in 2013 that involved conduct back into the 90s. I don't think that that's going to continue that length of time. Nevertheless, it shows how long it can take from an initial incident up and through the completion of an enforcement action. The point is that when the Department of Justice looks at something in 2015 for conduct that happened in 2010, 2012, or 2013, they'll be looking at it through the lenses of what's the best practices at that time, not the best practices when the conduct occurred. So the more you can have cutting-edge technology, the more you can invest your compliance resources, I think it's going to be better for you going forward. I think transaction monitoring is here to stay. I think transaction monitoring is something that you need to take a very close look at for your compliance program. I think that will help your company do business better because it gives you the ability to look at a wide range of data points to determine why something has succeeded or perhaps not succeeded. But certainly if you have that information from the compliance perspective, it's going to help you going forward. I'm Tom Fox. If you have any questions about this, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report.